Hi, welcome back. In this video, we'll be learning about some advanced functions and settings that can help us get a more accurate exposure in our shots. So till now, when it comes to the light meter, we've been seeing that we need to get this light meter in the center before we take the shot. So that can involve, let's say, changing the shutter speed, as we have seen on certain occasions, opening up the aperture. Again, it depends on the situation that you're in, which setting you need to change, or let's say changing the ISO. But we need to get the meter in the center before we take the shot so that we get a balanced exposure and a shot which is neither too dark nor too bright. But sometimes, because of the complexity of the lighting in the environment, the camera can get a bit confused and we may not get an accurate exposure in our shot when the meter is in the center. For example, here, when I was shooting this portrait, not enough light was falling on my subject and there was more light in the background. So when I took this shot in the meter, my subject came a bit underexposed even though the background was of the right exposure. Similarly, you can get shots in which your subjects are overexposed because of the type of lighting that you're facing. So basically, every time getting the meter in the center won't always solve your problems. Most of the times it will, but sometimes what you'll find is that you're not happy with the exposure that you're getting and you may want to increase the exposure or decrease the exposure according to what you're getting. So in this exercise, just to demonstrate this, we'll be looking at this mannequin which is against a very strong window light, and we'll be seeing how to take this shot. And what you'll find is that when we take this shot with the meter in the center, we do not get a correct exposure because of the complexity of lighting involved. So let's see how to take this shot. Alright, so you can see here that we've got the mannequin against this really bright window. So let's see how we can take this shot. So let's go to our settings. So when it comes to the shutter speed, right now my focal length is, I'm just zoomed into 40 mm. So I'm just using a shutter speed of 1/40. So we're just assuming that I'm doing this handheld. But all this is right now not too important. And my f-stop is as less as I can go, which is to f3.8 because I'm slightly zoomed in. And then of course, to get my shot, what I have to do is I have to just set my ISO so that the light meter comes in the center. So let's see what ISO is that. So you can see right now, my camera is trying to tell me that at ISO 160, the light meter is in the center. So I can go ahead and take the shot. But what you'll find here is that the shot does not really look good because the mannequin is not properly exposed in this shot. So even though we took the shot when the light meter is in the center, until now we've been learning that we have to take shots in which the light meter is in the center because that gives us a proper exposure, right? But sometimes what can happen is that you may not be happy with that correct exposure, because what the camera is trying to just do is the camera is trying to just give you an average exposure for every element in the scene. Right? So, for example, if I just review this shot that we took with the meter in the center, everything in this shot looks fine, but the mannequin is underexposed. And let's say if I was doing this portrait shot, for me actually this particular part would be more important than anything else, and that is what is coming out wrong. Right? So how can we correct this? So there are a lot of ways to correct this, where you have to kind of override the camera system of exposure and you have to just bring in your own sense of exposure into it. So I'm just going to show you what I mean. For example, one very basic thing that you can do here is simply don't settle for the ISO which gets the meter in the center. Instead, you use an ISO which takes the meter slightly towards the overexposed side. Right? So let's see what happens when we do that. So let's say I don't stop with the meter in the center. What I do is I keep increasing my ISO. And let's say I go to ISO 640, where you can see the meter is showing me that it's going to be an overexposed shot. But what you'll find is that this shot will be better because even though it's overexposed, it actually gets what we want at the correct exposure, because the mannequin is more important than the background. So you can see here, if I compare it with the last shot, you can see that what has happened here is we've actually overexposed this shot, right? Technically, though this is a shot with the correct exposure, though technically we've just gone towards overexposure, but this is good for us because this gets whatever we want correct. So you can see the background in the last shot was actually correct, but since the background was not very important to us, we don't mind overexposing the background for this shot just to get our underexposed subject in the previous shot correct, because that is more important to us. So this is one way that whenever you feel something is dark in your shot, even with the meter in the center, and you really wanted that thing to come out at a much better exposure, you can just manually override this by selecting a higher ISO or any other setting that gets the meter towards the positive side. Now, one challenge you're going to face is that we've learned about auto ISO, right? So let me just activate the auto ISO setting. Because what happens on auto ISO is that we've already seen that the meter does not really work, right? So the camera is trying to select an ISO, like you can see here, the ISO is being selected is around 140. So the camera is just trying to automatically select the ISO which gets the meter in the center. And if you remember our first shot, we almost got to a similar ISO, which was ISO 160. So roughly we were using about the same ISO for our first shot, and that's what the camera is trying to do on auto ISO, because right now we've not been able to tell the camera that we want to overexpose this shot. So on auto ISO is just selecting this particular ISO which would have got the light meter in the center, just like our first shot that we took in this exercise, right? But there is a way even on auto ISO that you can tell the camera that, listen, I don't want you to get the meter in the center because I'm not happy with this exposure, right? Because if you were to take this shot right now, you would get something similar to our first shot. So you can tell your camera that, listen, I'm not happy with this, right? And since there's no way to manually override this right now, because you can't do anything about the meter on auto ISO, since the camera is selecting the ISO on its own, what you can do is there's a function called as exposure compensation. So if I just press the I button here and just go to this menu, and if you just notice this icon here, which is like a plus and minus sign together, often we use this button on our cameras to change aperture, if you remember, along with the command dial. So that icon or that symbol stands for exposure compensation, which, as the name suggests, is to compensate your exposure. That's what its function is for. So for example, if right now by default it is set to 0, but let's say if I take it towards the positive side, then what I'm trying to tell the camera is that whenever you calibrate your exposure reading with this meter, just make it slightly more than what would have been in the center. So you're telling your camera basically to overexpose your shot and select that ISO which would have got the meter slightly towards the positive side. So you can see the moment we've changed exposure compensation, your auto ISO right now is pointing towards 500. That means we just think of it like this. We've exactly done the same thing, that we have just gone towards the positive side. But this time, of course, you're not seeing the positive because the center is being calibrated in such a way that is actually towards the positive. So don't let this confuse you. We're basically telling the camera to overexpose the shot slightly because we're not happy with the base exposure that we were getting, right? So like now if I take this shot, this will be a much better shot because the camera will raise the ISO because we're telling it to deliberately overexpose the shot. So you can see that this shot is slightly better than, and this shot is similar to what we did manually, right? Suppose we want more of overexposure. Let's say we are not happy with this. We want the mannequin to come even more brighter. No problem. Just go to exposure compensation again, and you can just raise this slightly more. Maybe let's say 1.7. Now we're making everything even more brighter. So you can see the background will keep on becoming overexposed, but our subject, which is the mannequin, will keep on coming to be correct. So anytime you're not happy with your exposure, you can use the function of exposure compensation to just manipulate the exposure according to how you would like. So getting the meter in the center is not always correct. Most of the cases, yes, it will work, but sometimes in situations like these, for example, when there's a subject against a very bright light, or if you're shooting a very dark subject, which may not come out to be as properly exposed with the meter in the center, you can always use exposure compensation to correct this. Later on, of course, we'll also be seeing some more advanced ways to get over these things, which is the usage of flash, the usage of reflector, but that is something that we'll be seeing in the following sections, not right now. Right now, I just want to tell you how you can solve this problem right from your camera itself. Now, there's one issue, and that is for the Canon people. For Canon people, when you're on manual mode, in most of the cameras, in a lot of cameras, you cannot use the function of exposure compensation. So it just makes it invalid, right? So I'm just going to be switching over to the Canon camera now, and I'll be telling you what you guys can do when you are faced with such a problem. So let's go to the Canon camera. Okay, so this time we've got the Canon camera, and what you'll find is that, so you can see that my ISO is on auto. What you'll find is that when I go to menu here, that's where you activate exposure compensation. So you can see that we've got this function here, but if I just click on it, you can see that it's not really active. So you can see that these things are disabled because they work on something called as aperture priority and shutter priority modes, but that is something that we won't be looking or going into because that's not really important right now. But basically on the manual mode on some cameras, for example, the camera that I'm using here is the 700D by Canon, and on some of the cameras, exposure compensation doesn't work when you're shooting on manual mode, right? So what can you do here? So first of all, let's say if my ISO was not set to auto, then the thing would remain exactly the same as we did with Nikon. That is, you'll just have to manually go towards the positive side. For example, right now, my settings are set. Now I'll just have to keep on increasing my ISO. So let's say if I use an ISO which gets the meter in the center, just like we did with our Nikon camera, you'll find that we won't really be happy with this exposure, right? Because we want to give more preference to the mannequin. So of course I can do the same thing that we did before, that is to just raise the ISO. And if you check, the meter is towards the positive side right now, so you can see that we're manually making it higher and then taking an overexposed shot. So you can do that, but again, that would be a slower process. So let's say you're trying to shoot something which involves a quick type of photography. So what would you do? Let's say if you're on auto ISO, and then of course your camera is going to take this shot with the meter in the center, right? And you're going to get this problem. So this time, since we don't have exposure compensation on this camera, what we can do is we can use something called as a metering mode. So if I just press this Q button, what you'll see is that if you go to this option which says metering mode, you'll see some different types of metering modes. Now, metering modes can be a bit complex to understand, so I'm just going to tell you this in a very simple way. The default metering mode that you see here is called evaluative metering, which basically means how does a camera, when you're talking about a metering mode, you're just talking about how does a camera determine the correct exposure for the shot? How does it bring that light meter in the center? So when you're using evaluative metering, your camera is trying to give preference to all the elements in the shot. So it's trying to see the background also, and it's trying to see the exposure on the mannequin, and then it's just giving you a balanced exposure shot because it needs to get each element in this frame of the correct exposure, right? Because we've already seen if it were to only give preference to the mannequin, then that means what happens is that since we really need to raise the exposure for mannequin, the background will get very overexposed. But this won't happen in evaluative metering because the camera is giving preference to each part of the frame. So what you can do in this case is that there's a way to tell the camera that, listen, camera, not everything for me is important here, so don't give equal weightage when it comes to exposure to all the elements in this frame. I just want you to give more weightage to something on which my focus point is on, right? And how you can tell that is by changing the metering mode. So if I just go to the metering mode, you can see by default, we are at evaluative metering where everything is given preference, but we don't want that because that gives us an average exposure. So we can go to this option called as spot metering. And if I do this, what I'm telling the camera is that give only preference to that part where my focus point is on. That is on my subject. So if my subject is dark, do not hesitate in increasing my ISO. So the camera thinks like this, okay, the focus point is on the mannequin. The mannequin is actually in a type of lighting where not enough light is falling on it. That's why we were seeing that it was coming dark. So the camera, since the focus point is on it, and since we are on spot metering, the camera detects that spot and it says to itself, okay, this spot is really dark, not enough light is falling on it, and my owner has told me that only this part is important in the shot. So I'll simply raise the exposure. So you can see that the moment we select spot metering, the whole shot looks different. That's because the camera has now raised the exposure. So if you take this shot, this is being shot at now 3200 ISO. So the camera is actually ignoring the background behind. That's why even if it becomes overexposed like this, the camera does not really care. That's because we've told it to specifically care only about the spot on which we focus on, which is dark. So the camera raises the ISO. So this is another way by which you can correct your exposure if exposure compensation is not available on your camera. And of course, these metering modes are also available on the Nikon camera. So even the Nikon users can use metering modes if they don't want to use exposure compensation. So let's just have a look at the Nikon camera so that we can see these metering modes again. On the Nikon camera, you can press the I button to access the menu and then go on to the metering section to access the metering modes. The default metering mode is called as matrix metering, which is the same as the default mode on Canon, which is called as evaluative metering, just like we saw before. So on the matrix metering mode, the camera will give equal preference to all the elements in the frame, and you'll get a balanced exposure. So in case you want to avoid that, in situations where you're finding that your subject is not properly exposed, just like we saw before, you can change over the metering mode on the Nikon camera or any other camera that you have. All cameras offer these different metering modes. For example, you can switch over to center weighted metering, in which case the camera will give more preference to whatever is in the center of the frame. So it's used a lot sometimes in portraits, for example. Or like we've seen before, the camera also offers the spot metering mode, which you can use to get the exposure correct exactly on that point where your focus point is lying on. So the whole point of this exercise is that you should know that getting the meter in the center or the light meter in the center is not always correct, and sometimes it helps to go with what your eye is telling you. So now that you know how to change the exposure through different settings and functions, you'll not only be reliant on the light meter. So I hope this video helped you to understand how different functions can help you get a more accurate exposure. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.
I hope that you like this video. This video is from my DSLR Photography for Beginners course, which is available via Udemy. And as you can see in front of you on Udemy, it has a rating of 4.8. It has 45 videos and almost 6 hours of video content. And doesn't matter whether you have a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, this course will help you master your camera and photography. So in case you like this video, you want to check out the whole course, do give it a go. The link will be given in the description. I hope to see you inside the course.